Well, hello and welcome to this Fotospeed video with me, Tim Jones, and I've got Mr. Vince Casey as well, and I've got the amazing Jill Furmanovsky.
Oh, thank you for that introduction.
And rock photographer, music photographer.
Photographer.
A photographer.
Professional
who
photographer.
so happened to photograph all these amazing people.
And one of my favourite photographers.
Yes. Before we get started in talking all these amazing photographs back on the table here and things, please don't forget to subscribe to the Fotospeed YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button underneath. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fotospeed newsletter to keep up to all the latest news from us here at Fotospeed. I'll put a link in the description below you can click, but you just head over to photospeed.com and click on newsletter and you can sign up there. So that's a little bit of the housekeeping out the way. So without further ado, let's dive into talking about Jill's amazing photography. Now, I know Vince is itching to find out about Pink Floyd, but we will move on. We will get on to that. But first, well, thank you, first of all, for giving us some time to come to your amazing studio here and see all these amazing prints. I suppose really we should start right at the beginning. And how did you get into the opportunities, I suppose, and photography to start with?
Oh gosh, I'm going to have to précis this because we could be here for some time. I'm going to give you the shortest possible version I can. So I was born in Africa. I was born in a little place called Bulawayo, which was Rhodesia, and lived there till I was 11 when my parents moved here. And my father was an architect and my mum was a teacher. And my father's hobbies were playing the guitar and photography. So as a youngster, he had a wonderful collection of vinyl jazz records. He was a big jazz fan, and he played rhythm guitar in a dance band. And then his hobby was photography. So he used to photograph mainly the kids and, personal pictures, obviously, that sort of thing. He wasn't, and buildings, obviously, because he was working. And we had a darkroom at home. And so I used to sit on a high stool and watch him print.
The magic.
Yeah, the magic, the abracadabra.
The tray. Yeah.
Just to this day, isn't it? Still magic.
Still is magic.
And I just remember it vividly. And anyway, at some point there was economic problems and my parents also were not supporters of the South African regime. And when we had to leave, we came to the UK. I was a bit devastated coming from an African town where I had a lot of freedom on my bicycle and so on to this cold, wet country.
Yeah.
Not very friendly. Didn't know what avocado pears were at all and things like that. But it was the time of the Beatles. And so that was the compensation. It was the 60s, mid-60s.
What a time.
Yeah. And so I became a Beatles fan and joined the fan club. And I had an auntie who lived near Abbey Road. So I used to go there, pretend to visit her and stand outside with the other kids. Just a bit too young to be what they call an apple scruff. But, so 13, 14 with my Kodak Instamatic camera that I had by then. Once took a picture of Paul McCartney standing outside his house, which was in Abbey Road. That was my first rock shot. Then time passed and I got into prog rock and so on and went to art school. And I was at Harrow School of Art and then the Central School of Art and Design, which was filled with not just art students, but art students who like music, including Joe Strummer, who's on the foundation course, and Lena Lovitch, a punk sculptress who was also there.
Wow.
So it was a funny time of where art school was encouraging music, and you kind of knew that Roxy Music had art school connections, John Lennon had art school connections, there were lots of art music connections in the UK particularly. And you could get into art school with a good portfolio if you hadn't passed all your exams. So I was at art school, I got in to do textile design, and part of the course was a 2-week photography course, which at that time you couldn't get a degree in photography except from a technical college, like the London College of Printing, but not in the art school, except for the Royal College, which was postgrad. So people learnt photography to photograph their work. That was the purpose of the 2-week course. But it was taught by professionals. And they had fantastic darkroom in the basement, and they had a studio for shooting in for fashion and textile students. So I took advantage of all of that. But that was later. I was on the 2-week course, and at the end of the first week, having learnt how to load the camera, a Pentax, Spotmatic or something, process a film, make a contact sheet, we then got a roll of film and was sent out for the weekend with it to come back on Monday and do another. And I went to the Rainbow Theatre. I went to see the group Yes play.
Yeah, wow.
And with friends, and I was in the balcony at the top, and with this lens I couldn't really, the little dots on the stage.
Yeah.
But I saw in the aisle some photographers working, and once the gig had started, I thought, I wonder if I could get away with going down there. And I don't even know how I had the courage to do it, but I did, and nobody stopped me.
Did you find the camera assisted with that courage?
Precisely, and also they were rarer then to have a kind of a camera with a lens, was as opposed to an Instamatic was.
It looked professional.
It did.
Therefore, you must have been a professional photographer.
Yes, and then also once the gig has started, there's nobody about because the storm is in the eye there. So I just walked down the aisle as if I was meant to be there, and got down there and took some pictures as best I could. They weren't very good. And at the end of the show, 2 guys down there who'd worked for the Rainbow Theatre, they were the official photographers, they said to me, "Are you professional?" or, something like that. And I said, "Oh, yes. I'd done 4.5 days.
As you do.
Yeah, why not?
And they said, "Oh, well, that's great," because they were off to make a film. They asked if I wanted to take over the position.
Timing is impeccable.
It is, yeah. So Monday, I went back to college for the second week, and I said, "I've got a job as a photographer."
Look at these pictures. That's
And they were terrible. Yeah.
So you had a lot of learning to do in a short space of time.
That's it, yeah. And the rest is history, really,
Yeah.
because from then on, I didn't look back, really. And I stayed on at college, moved to graphics and got a degree in graphics eventually.
Yeah.
By that time, it was 1974 something, and I was already quite established as a live photographer with the music press.
Yes.
And that's when, so once I left college, I did have some work.
Okay. And I decided to shoehorn a little bit of Pink Floyd in. So you were in Abbey Road Studios working with Floyd for the
I did.
Dark Side of the Moon session.
No, that was for the Wish You Were Here.
Wish You Were Here session.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Dark Side of the Moon, of which this is one here.
Yeah.
This is the Dark Side of the Moon tour 1974.
Yeah.
And that was because I took my portfolio to show Hypnosis, Storm Thorgerson and Poe. And they weren't in the slightest bit interested in pictures of bands, really. They were like, well, sometimes we need pictures of bands, disappointingly. And I think they must have thought my work was good enough.
Yeah.
And they probably thought a girl on the road, because it was those kind of days, would be a good idea as well. And they sent me on the Dark Side of the Moon tour. And so that was my baptism by fire, with Storm shouting at me, going, telling me all these assignments, Roger Waters playing golf, they're playing squash, the road crew is setting up, they're taking it down, when David Gilmour's playing backgammon in one of the rooms, going photograph that.
So it's almost like it's the whole documentary.
The whole documentary.
And the playing as well. So it's the whole story, really. Isn't
exactly. And again, I look at those pictures and think, oh. But
it's a story. It's a
they're unique now, these
caption
pictures.
in time, isn't it? And it's nice to look back at the prints from that era and brings you right back there, I guess.
It does, yeah. And I did okay. And after that, I then started to do feature work for the music press.
Okay.
That started around that time, 74. And when punk came along 2 years later, that was when I really got my break, because I was the same sort of age as the punks.
Right, okay.
Whereas these prog groups were kind of, they were like, Led Zeppelin, they were
the gods of rock.
They were the gods, and the punks were they were hopeless. They didn't know how to play their instruments. No. I didn't know how to use my cameras. They didn't know how to do, we were on the level playing field.
Oh.
And I did their artwork, and that sort of thing as well, because I had the graphic design degree. So there you are. That's how I began.
You photographed the Clash, is that right?
Yes, I photographed the Clash live. And also I did some portraits as well. Penny Smith was the Clash's photographer. She was so fantastic. But yes, I did photograph. I tended to be given the kind of the more difficult punk bands, I suppose. By the time I didn't do much on the Sex Pistols, really. In fact, when they were going, I was working with Floyd, so I was working with the old farts, really. But I was very interested in punk, and I did the Buzzcocks. I did a couple of record sleeves for the Buzzcocks. I worked with your Sham 69s, your Angelic Upstarts, Cockney Rejects, Blondie, of course, we considered punk at that time. Iggy
definitely.
Pop.
Yeah.
And so it goes on, really.
You forget what short space of time Sex Pistols were around.
Yes.
And what a big impact they made on the
yes.
music industry.
The whole of punk was 18 months, really, from our point of view. And I worked with Sniffing Glue magazine, though, because they had broken into an office in Dryden Chambers where the Sex Pistols had an office, and so did Miles Copeland, who was doing prog groups. And Miles was very fascinated by punk, and his brother Stuart Copeland started the Police.
I was about to say no relation to Stuart then.
Absolutely, a relation to
And you photographed Police then?
I did, because Miles for a while was my boyfriend, and I was living in his house in St John's Wood, which was quite a step up from my student digs. Yeah. And Stuart was rehearsing in the basement with Curved Air initially, and then the Police. So they were on the doorstep.
In the basement. Literally.
In the basement. Yeah. They were literally in the basement, So I got to photograph that. But they weren't considered punk. They were them and Elvis Costello and others of that ilk were not considered to be punk by the punks. It's quite an interesting
sound, isn't it? It's almost reggae, indie rock sort of hybrid.
It was a hybrid and yes, and then we very quickly dovetailed into ska through, two-tone, new wave that came on after that. And by 1979, I was doing like 80 shoots a year. I was really, really busy. Yeah.
And were you outsourcing your processing of the films and all that sort of stuff at that stage, or were you still printing yourself in the darkroom?
No, I was printing in the darkroom right up till the digital era,
so
really.
You were very busy.
Very busy, yeah. I didn't have a studio at that point. I was living in a basement flat myself, in the mid 80s, and I had quite a long hall in the basement, and so I just put a curtain at either end and a table in the middle, and that put the enlarger on the wall, and used the shower for washing the prints and so on. But yeah, you'd be making RC darkroom prints and taking around to NME, Melody Maker, whoever it was that you were working for. Yeah. Leave the prints on the desk, and I've got a whole cabinet full of them. Actually, we can flick through them.
Oh, that'd be nice.
Yeah,
that would be quite fun for you to see that.
I'll put a shot of them in. Yeah, so really interesting.
And I guess print was so important back then. It's the only way you could really see the images, wasn't it?
Yes, colour was not asked for really right until, for us, the smash hits, 1979 smash hits. Before that, colour wasn't really required. And frankly, I didn't know how to shoot it terribly well.
I was about to say, it must have changed things for you completely. Black and white colour, it's such a contrast, isn't it? Such
a contrast. And also, I really wasn't familiar with using flash or those kind of things. Right. In punk, you had a flash on the top of the camera. That was the look of punk, wasn't it? It was like a flash gun image. Yeah. But when the face came along, and it was suddenly, we had more status as photographers, more like fashion people, and they wanted colour, and I learned how to use a Hasselblad, and I learned how to use a monolight, and that was a big learning curve. And then in 1982, I got my own studio.
Wow.
Yeah.
So up to that point, because everyone likes to know cameras and things, so what were you shooting? Was the 60s and up to the 70s, was that kind of on your Pentax still, or was you upgraded?
Well, I was using just an Instamatic until that course in photography, and then Pentax 1000s, I think, or K1000s, I think they're called. But my father, I still got it in a case there, had a Pentax S1A, which had a little meter on the top. I inherited that from him once I'd done the course. So I used that for quite a while, the Pentax. And then when I could afford it, I got a Nikon, and I think I was using Nikon FEs. One, and then I got a second Nikon FEs and fixed lenses. There was no zooms because they were too slow. And so you'd be changing lens in the pit. You'd have two camera bodies, and if you needed colour, you'd use the second body for colour and the other one for black and white.
The workout with the weight of the cameras probably as well.
Yes.
Big lenses, prime lenses.
Big prime lenses, exactly, not very fast. And the films were, especially the colour was very primitive and pushing the colour.
I was about to say, grainy colour doesn't work so well, I guess. You're shooting in low light, it's probably quite difficult catching.
Yes, and tungsten film was hard to come by. It was only 160 ASA.
Right, okay.
Eventually, I think it went up to 320 ASA, and then you could push it. But yes, it was. Whereas the black and white was all processed in-house. I always had a darkroom. I had a darkroom at home initially. In my parents' house, I had a darkroom in my bedroom. Then I had a darkroom in the corridor. And then when I got a studio, I got a darkroom, and I still got a darkroom, which for I don't know how much longer. But yeah, but to me, not all photographers are interested in printing, but I was always very interested in printing.
It's a big part of the process, isn't it?
Was that? I know a lot of photographers kind of outsource that because of time and things, but that was a really important bit that you were part of that process.
Yes, very much so. I really felt printing was a kind of an art. And I got really adept at it. I mean, I'd have a little torch and I'd, put some black tape around, we'd leave a little hole and then just, fogging out corners.
Dodging and burning. Yes,
Dodging and burning.
It's a skill, isn't it?
Yeah.
Actually still important even in digital.
And then also overlaying one negative on top of another, doing an exposure. I've got one of the Temptations, I think, one where they're in focus and looking towards me, and the other one, which I did a long exposure, where they're dancing and they're all blurry. And I put the two negs, first I printed the top and blocked it, and then, I did stuff like that. I did solarizing in the darkroom for the 80s, Boy George, I solarized his hair in the darkroom. I mean, all lith printing, I became obsessed with that as well.
It almost becomes something different than the print, doesn't it? It becomes this work of art, really, I suppose, because you're
part of the process, aren't you?
You've got that
and you've printed it.
Photography, but then you've also done some bits to it to make it a little bit different, a little bit more stylistic.
I must say that it's also haphazard. No two prints of mine were ever alike, which is not a good thing when
if you're doing an edition, I guess.
Exactly. No, there was inconsistency in a big way.
Yeah, I suppose now they're one-offs, aren't they? So
it's quite a nice one, really.
People want to collect them all, I'd imagine. Different versions. So I suppose it just snowballed then. You just kind of photographed some, and then that led to something. It was just that time, those decades were just like that. It's something that probably doesn't exist as much now. Am I right to say? Do you think?
We're in the digital era now. I think of the analog era as the rock and roll era, the analog era.
Yeah.
Also for sound. And then when we went digital, it affected right across the board, didn't it? Every single thing changed around that time.
How was that for you? Was it, you went from the film and were you a first?
It spans Oasis, actually. So Oasis, my archive starts on film. And then around 2005 even earlier, really. In fact, way back, I think in 1997, I was given one of the first digital cameras to use, and it was a Nikon with a gigantic battery attached to it. I've got a picture of it, and the battery was like down to here, and it took, I don't know, something like 300 kilobyte files or something like that. So, nothing too big that you could really use, and very slow.
Yeah,
very slow. I mean, you were not shooting the moment; you're shooting long after the moment. The moments after the moment.
You've already missed the moment in a way.
Way
thinking
missed
about
the moment.
The camera rather than what you.
Well, the camera, you'd click it, but it didn't go off immediately. All of that was just terrible. So I gave up on cameras in the 90s. I thought, I'm not doing cameras, but of course I love the printing.
But you were involved in some of the first digital prints with the inkjet
absolutely
printing,
was.
And then the dye prints, the iris prints.
Yeah, so this is the crossover. Was this Oasis exhibition I did called Was There Then? It was a massive exhibition, and it was in the Roundhouse, the whole Roundhouse, before it was done out. So the pigeons flying around at the time, and we had the whole Roundhouse. So that was very sponsored by the new technologies. So in the program for it, there's an ad from Olympus saying obituary to film. So that was like, oh lordy. And then Epson were doing their first beautiful inkjet printers, but there were no archival inks. So that was a problem. But to actually print in colour with a white background, white edge around it, to me that was just incredible. And Photoshop I totally embraced as well. So of course you were having to scan, but then you could clean up all those dust and scratches, and the clone tool was like a revolution in its own right, I think.
Did you print your own colour work in when you're shooting film, or did you outsource that?
No, I didn't print colour. No, I never printed colour. I learnt at college, but it was well complicated.
To try and get any control over it was so difficult. So moving to digital, you had a lot more control printing.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the digital printing to me was a miracle. And Photoshop and that, they were the two miracles. The cameras, I was very hesitant about.
But the printing was kind of there. It was good.
The printing was brilliant, yeah. Not so much, I mean, the black and white, you could still, beautiful silver gel. Yeah. But the colour, that was brilliant, yeah.
Yeah, when it came out, I just remember colour printing and thinking, no, not for me. The colour wheel, and we had I remember at college we had a big machine. You put it in, and then about 40 minutes later, this print would have come out, and you go, "Oh, it's green."
Yeah,
so you go back in all again. Then
that's right. Yeah,
we had filters on the wall. We had a darkroom at home, and my dad had like a chart of all the different colour filters, and we had to do different things for different films. And even then, it was never quite right.
And that was that C41.
C41,
because that at least gave you a white background. But if you're trying to print from transparency, that was a nightmare. And they came up with a black background, which you didn't want. That was the other thing.
It was the look. It was kind of the look you had to embrace, I guess, wasn't it?
Yeah.
What point did you move to digital cameras then, would you say?
I got, I think I had to 2005. I got a job where I had no choice. By that time, it was much better. And actually, I would have wanted a Nikon, because I was a Nikon user by that time, and had the lenses. But the problem was, it was a waiting list. I think it was for the something 100 Nikon. And there was
100, yeah.
That's it. I couldn't get one. I had to queue up for it, and I had a job. So I thought, well, okay, well, I'll have to have a Canon. And Canon were on par. In fact, they were probably slightly ahead at that point. So I just bought a Canon, whatever it was, EOS, whatever it was, with a huge battery thing. And
so 1D or something.
Yeah, something like that. And off I went. I just used it and,
embraced it and accepted it. And
I mean, the problem with it was, by that time we had Rock Archive here, which is a collective of photographers, and some photographers were already shooting on that. But all those files from that era, 2004, 2005, 2006, they're 25 meg files. And we do AO prints. You're pushing it. You could just about do an A2 or something, but some of those, and there's some like brilliant pictures that just wouldn't blow up that big. And also, not many people were shooting RAW. So if you're shooting JPEGs, you couldn't do those kind of wonderful manipulations that you can now do with RAW, where you can pull in, take the highlights down, pull up the shadows and all that sort of thing. So yeah, that whole 10-year block, I would say, was a little bit on the dodge side as far as what we were doing, which was printing.
Well, there's huge improvements in technology, wasn't there?
I suppose it wasn't really until like the 5D came out, or the 1D Mark II, wasn't it? They were the first, from Canon in a way, they were the real first ones that you could go, okay, this is...
That's absolutely right, yeah. So and then I went digital, and I haven't gone back to film, actually, I have not. Although I still have a darkroom because I have a lot of negatives.
Yes. You mentioned Rock Archive.
Yeah.
So Rock Archive... When did that start for you?
Rock Archive started after that Oasis exhibition, because it was the first exhibition that actually had both. So every print that was in that exhibition, there were more than 100, said who had printed it and what on. So and there was an Epson machine as you walked in, because we were sponsored by Epson, so they had their machine. We were sponsored by Olympus. Olympus had a studio where they had a big backdrop, which was Noel and the rest of the band walking across King's Cross as sort of zebra crossing. And Liam wasn't there, but you could dress up as Liam. They had like a rail of Liam clothes. And you could put on, a parka and some shades, be Liam and stand in there with the band and Noel. And have your picture taken on an Olympus camera and walk off at the end with a print. Wow. So this was a revolution in its own right. And then also the fashion companies like Adidas and Levi's also sponsored. So we had these huge Levi cushions, and we had Adidas football lighting. Okay. It was fantastic, actually. And we had giant prints on canvas, and then also a film which I shot on a Samsung camera. I thought we'd better have some video. We had holograms, because I decided we better have a hologram. That'd be cool. So it was like a revolution in all of it. And at the end, I was left with the kit and a website. I thought websites seemed to be a good idea. Yeah. We had a website for that, but not many people were using them then. So I thought, well, what would be a good website? And I thought, what about Rock Archive? because then I could bring in other photographers.
So it's a collection of photographers' work over
Yes,
time.
because I was like, I've got gaps in my archive. Obviously, for various reasons, I didn't do David Bowie, I didn't do Nina Simone. There was all these gaps. I was like, but I know photographers who did.
Sure.
And then Storm Thorgerson was very keen on the idea of doing prints. He loved prints. So he came in as well. And I just said to all, my mates, I said, look, just give me like 5 of your pictures. It doesn't have to be your best one. And we'll make limited edition prints of them. And let's see if we can do that. And the idea was an archive of archives, a portal for rock photography. And that's 25 years later what it still is.
And you're still here doing
And I was hoping it would be a museum by now, but nobody's come up to do a museum.
I hope it does, because some amazing pictures in the archives.
Well, also the footfall. My exhibition in Manchester, my retrospective had like 25,000. The 2 we did before, one on the Manchester music scene with the collective, that had even more, 35,000. Nothing to do with us, but Chalky Davis, the great photographer in Wales, he had one that was 41,000.
Wow.
But there's nowhere for these exhibitions to go and no museum to put them in.
Which seems crazy, really, in this day and age. I mean, there is still so much interest in the form of print, isn't there?
Yeah.
You look at a print and you've been to your exhibition, you go there and people will spend long periods of time looking at the prints.
Absolutely, because prints are really beautiful. I mean, it's nice to see them on the screen, but to see a print on the wall is just magical, really.
It still is magic. I mean, so you look on a mobile phone and you might give it a couple of seconds and a like and a share, but you look at a print and you can really, it takes you back to the moment.
It does. You can really dive. You can dive in. You can dive into them.
Yeah.
They're
There's
big
things
enough
you
to dive
notice
in.
in print that you don't notice on the screen at all.
Mm.
It's usually the mistakes you make.
I was about to say, for the better or the worse, you'll see a dust spot or something.
In my case, anyway, it's always the things I've missed. But
you see a lot more in print, for
you
sure.
do. And it
Definitely.
It's got heart and soul, hasn't it? But also, I guess the different papers can make a difference. And I note that the papers you use from Fotospeed are generally always a matte paper. So a particular reason for that?
Well, we're making fine art prints, I suppose, and I like to sign and caption in pencil. And you can do that on the matte papers. On the glossy ones, you can't actually. You've got to use a pen.
Yes, that's right.
I know it's only a small thing, but I do really like to see the pencil. And actually, some of the surfaces take the pencil better than others. The older paper's not so good, even though we use it anyway. Yeah, so that's one of the reasons is that, but also just they're beautiful. The matte prints, they're absolutely beautiful, and we do use sometimes the glossy prints for if we're doing large areas of black. We do use the glossy. They're a little bit more hardy, and you get those very solid glossy blacks. Yeah. Whereas these actually do mark quite easily, so they have to be treated a little bit differently. It's the chalky surface of the paper.
I guess the glossy fine art papers are more reminiscent of the darkroom fibre-based papers, aren't they, in that sense?
Yeah. I tried some the other day, actually. You sent me a package of different ones, and I tried to reproduce the kind of darkroom look with that. Didn't quite work for me. Went back in the end to doing it for the client on
the matte paper.
On the matte paper,
and actually you can get a really nice deep black on the matte papers now, to be fair, can't you?
Yeah.
And that one's on the highlight smooth, so it's got a nice bright white base, isn't it? And
it's lovely.
Cotton rag. So it's
beautiful.
True fine art paper.
Yeah, so it's a paper. It's just a beautiful paper. It just does what it says, doesn't it? It's easy to print on in most cases.
I think it's nice to find a paper that suits your style and stick with it. There are obviously so many different papers out there, and it's quite confusing trying to work out which paper to put your images on. If you can find a paper that works for your style.
With those, you do those packs of different kinds of papers, which actually is very, very useful. Yeah. And then you can just test it out. You could try the same picture on different ones, and they look different.
It's the best way to do it. Pick a couple of different images, a black and white and a colour, and run them off on all the
on the papers, and then
decide which one works for
exactly.
you. Stick with it. It's nice to have some consistency as well, because I guess a lot of your work are part of a collection, so they're limited edition. So you want to stick with the paper.
That's right.
For that run then. So
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And I guess with digital printing, the prints are so much more consistent than printing in the darkroom.
Yeah.
So you click a button and they kind of come out right.
They do.
Every time.
They do.
Obviously, colour management's an important part of the process with using the correct profile through the software. But once it's all set up correctly, they are always coming out the same.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
And a digital black and white print comes out actually quite neutral now, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you go back to the early days, a black and white print would have a bit of a colour cast.
Yeah.
Now they are really.
It's always green or magenta, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
One or the other.
Yes, one or the other. Most unpleasant. Yeah.
So we're talking about videography and the crossover with photography, and how amazing both of them are.
Well, yeah. I think that's how. I don't know if you found it. Probably not with the younger people getting into this style of photography, the music scene and things. That I have seen a lot of people just videoing for the 3 songs and then just taking stills out of that.
Really?
Oh, is that right?
I don't know if everyone's doing that. I've been out of the scene for a long time.
So
Yeah.
surprisingly.
Well, yes, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because then you're not going to miss a single frame, are you? There's no anticipation. You could actually go and have a cup of coffee
And then just go back.
and just
go,
come back
oh,
after the 3 songs and pick up your camera and talk a
That'd
few
be a shame, wouldn't it? Yeah.
It seems cheating, but I don't know.
I tell you one interesting story about video, though, is that when I was doing this crossover period, I got a Samsung camera, which was obviously lo-fi at the time, and went off with Oasis to the States. And I read the instructions on the plane of how to use the thing. And it said that you could freeze frame and do a still while you're shooting video. I thought, oh, well, that could be quite handy. Not realizing that you could do that in post-production. Yeah. I just didn't twig. So I went and shot. And whenever I was shooting a sequence, if it lined up that Liam was, for example, sitting on the edge of the stage, and then I'd line up a still, yeah, and click. And then it would freeze in the video. What was interesting about it was that it was like being in the brain of a stills photographer, because a stills photographer will look at a scene and then move to frame it to the right framing and then click on the moment that something is actually happening. So where it was useful, that Samsung film that didn't happen in post-production was the way one was actually setting up pictures. It was like being straight into the brain of somebody doing stills. So I thought that was interesting at the time. Now, of course, it's all changed and you don't need to do any of that. But I do think you need a different part of the brain when you're shooting moving images to stills. And that story has astonished me, that, somebody could shoot 3 songs and then just take stills out of that and not have missed anything.
It's a scary concept, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose. You can get quite high res pictures out of them as well.
Yeah, very high
4K,
res.
8K, and things like that.
A1.
Not saying everyone is. There's still a lot of people doing stills, but yeah, it's that you just go along and film, walk up and down the pit, and off you go.
You've got everything you need.
And then just go and have a drink. And
I suppose you still have to point it in the right direction.
you do, yeah, you do.
There is a little
you still
bit
have
of
to
skill
kind of know.
involved. Point it.
And then you have to
correct
debate,
person.
well, do I want a portrait or landscape shots? And all that kind of thing, I suppose. But I suppose you just crop out.
Yeah.
It's not something I've ever done, to be honest. It's myself. But anyway, yeah.
But it's all changing in terms of photography at the gigs as well. Everyone's a photographer, aren't they? They all have their iPhones with them, and they're all photographing and filming, which I think is a real shame because they're missing out a lot of the gig, but they're kind of living the gig through their mobile
Yes.
phone.
Well, of course, I've always lived all my gigs through looking through a camera, but it's not the same because actually you've got it to your eye.
Yeah.
Whereas a mobile phone is here,
Digital,
isn't it?
Isn't it?
Mainly,
Yeah.
you don't put
You're
it.
looking at a screen.
Yeah, you're
you're
looking
missing
at
the
a
moment.
screen exactly. I'm actually in there.
It's
One is
straight
in
through
there.
that glass.
It's a different.
Yeah.
It is a different thing. I thought about it because I've got no problem with people using phones for anything at all, but I personally don't have any feeling for the pictures that I shoot on the phone.
No.
I don't even look at them again. Whereas, and even with the Canon stuff I'm shooting, editing is a headache because there's so much. But the Leica, which has slowed me right down, and which is difficult, and therefore that I can't wait to get the card out and have a look and see what I managed to get in focus, what I can do with the raw file, cropping it down, the limitation on the lenses, because they don't really do long lens shots on Leicas.
No, you're saying it's the same lenses as you're using back in...
Yes, mainly the
days,
longest is a 90 that I used the other day for a gig. That's it.
You've got an M10, haven't you?
Yes.
Have you got one with a screen on the back? Or
Yes.
Not? Do
you use the screen or do you still shoot?
No, I shoot through them
properly.
Yeah.
Properly, but I would check the exposure with that because actually, you can get the exposure wrong very
That is one
easily.
big benefit of digital, isn't it? You can quickly check and make sure everything is lined up. See, with film, you weren't 100% sure until it comes out.
That's it, exactly, yeah.
I guess there was a big change, that transition from shooting the whole gig just to 3 songs and you're out. Did that change things for you as well?
Yes, you want the last 3 songs, don't you? You don't want the
Yeah.
first 3. Somebody's making a documentary on my career.
Amazing.
Called The Invisible Photographer. And so Neville Brody called this exhibition that was in Manchester, Photographing the Invisible, which I thought was just a play on words. But photographing the invisible is perhaps a nice expression because it's to do with photographing behind what's being on the surface. You kind of need to see beyond the surface. And I like that as a kind of an image of, especially for portraiture. So I did that exhibition. It was not a selling exhibition, it was a cultural exhibition. What that means is that the library have no finance at all. And there was no grants or anything. There was nothing to hang it on. We had to really be imaginative of how we used that space because it was all being funded by myself and Rock Archive. And then I think you guys came in and a couple of other people did, so we could frame the pictures because at one point we thought we couldn't frame them. So No Music, No Life is the name of the exhibition. And you'll see the little ad for Rock Archive, which is called No Music, No Life, which I guess sums it all up, doesn't it?
Yes,
I think so.
I think that's
definitely
perfect place to kind of bring our conversation to an end. And I mean, thank you so much for
been a great
giving us
pleasure
your
to
time.
be able to talk shop with you.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
So as always, don't forget to subscribe to the Fotospeed YouTube channel and sign up to our newsletter on photospeed.com. And on that note, we will say bye-bye and we will see you next time.
See you
Bye-bye.
next time.